With Destiny 2 on the horizon comes a lot of hope for the sequel in the franchise. Will they fix many of the original game's many shortcomings? How different is the sequel going to be than the original? I don't know, but we can start to speculate. With the gameplay reveal coming in May, I figure what better time to share my hopes and desires for the sequel than now. Here are my top 10 things I want to see in Destiny 2. So let's get the obvious one out of the way. Vanilla Destiny did not have a good story. It was incredibly bland, and you just kind of went with the motions and went along for the ride. And when it was all done, you weren't really sure what you actually did. Did you just kill a god or something? It was some sort of machine god? I don't know. Bungie made great strides to rectifying the story with the Taken King and Rise of Iron, but there were many things left out that only those willing to dive into the lore could figure out. There is a bountiful lore in this game, but you wouldn't know that without exploring outside sources. So what Destiny 2 should do is get rid of all the obscurity and be direct with the story. If they desire to keep cryptic lore hints in the game, make them more accessible to players. Give us the tools we need to understand everything in the game. As for the actual plot, we need more emotion and less exposition. It's hard to get engaged in any story when we have no one to really care about. The Taken King gave Cade a lot of life, and that was great because everyone found a character they could really like. And we need a lot more of that in the sequel. Give us more interesting enemies, give us more interesting side characters. Heck, even make our Guardians actually, have some character of their own. It was always up to Ghost to keep the dialogue going. It'd be nice if our Guardians spoke more in the sequel. Keep everything in the game. Another major part of Destiny that was incredibly flawed was the fact that if you wanted to make the most out of your Destiny experiences, you had to go to their website or use outside sources. Did you know there is a whole story behind the exotics, the Last Word and Thorn? And that's just a small fragment of the amount of lore that is hidden outside of the game. If you wanted to easily transfer a weapon from one of your characters to another, you would have to use an app. Otherwise, you would have to visit the vault, dump the desired gear in there, and then switch to another character, and then visit your vault to pick it up. It wouldn't be so bad if you weren't logged out of the game every time you wanted to switch. Also, if you wanted to keep track of your progress of finding collectibles, you were better off using an app as well. Time and time again, you are forced to use outside sources, and that is not how a game should be. They could easily have a section in your menu to access Firemac cards for the lore. It's all just text, so there's no reason why they couldn't just put it in the game in the first place. And if they don't want to put it in our menu, they could easily just have a library of source that we could visit for the lore. Anything is better than having to go to a website for it. As for the gear problem, they could implement an accessible vault via the menu, or they could have a unified inventory for your characters, so there'd be less of a need for a vault. They could also just implement an in-game method of just snatching your other character's gear without switching, or they could eliminate the need to have to log out just to switch characters altogether. That last suggestion should really be in the sequel regardless of the gear issue. Nothing is more frustrating than having to log back into the game, especially if all you want to do is just drop off a piece of gear. And finally, a simple in-game counter for collectibles is all we need. I know they did have a counter in place for a couple things like the chests and the fragments you could find on the Dreadnought, but they were all on the map, and it would have been really helpful to have an in-game counter as you collect them. The first Destiny had an abysmal amount of PvE events. I can count them on my hand, in fact. Can you guess how many there were? And no, public events don't count for this. We're talking about special events that take up a certain amount of days of the week to access. I'll give you a minute to think about it. I'll wait here, I ain't going nowhere. Did you get it? Alright. If you guessed 2, then you're correct. We had a PvE event called Queen's Wrath that showed up twice in Destiny's lifespan. Once in its first month, and once more before the release of the expansion House of Wolves, where Queen's Wrath was made into a joke that no one really cared for anymore. PvP, on the other hand, got all the love from Bungie, with the reoccurring Iron Banner and Trials of Osiris, which happens literally every weekend now. Heck, I'll even toss in Sparrow Racing here as another PvP event that happens now seasonally. This is an incredibly depressing statistic about the original game. While I have performed decently well at PvP, it isn't my go-to activity for fun in Destiny. One could argue the new story missions could make up for the lack of PvE events, but I disagree. There should be something more. Something like an enemy siege on a social space would make for a cool occasional recurring PvE event. Maybe Bungie doesn't really know what to do with PvE events, but they honestly don't need to be especially rewarding. Just something that keeps things lively and non-stagnant in the community. I could list some more ideas here, like let's say a power struggle changes so they need us to quell the uprising. Bam, there you go, a temporary event where one enemy faction temporarily takes over an opposing enemy faction's area. Or heck, maybe make ultras appear more often, causing some sort of crazy loot drop chance. Just keep things interesting is all I'm asking for. Nothing was more frustrating in social places than not being able to do anything to really pass the time. Accessing vendors and quest givers is one thing, but we needed way more ways to interact with our fellow Guardians. Bungie expected you to stay entertained with a few random interactive commands that really didn't do much, and a couple of stray balls to juggle around with. Even worse, you couldn't do anything without going into your console's system messages. More often than not, they would be gone before you ever sent them a message. You would have to troll with emotes to get their attention. They could easily change this by adding a chat function. I can understand that using the chat for the sake of avoiding a toxic community, but we need to have at least some easy ways to tell people what we want. Maybe some simple pre-programmed messages for looking for group, or looking to raid, or looking to do nightfall, you know, basic messages that people will want to get across in Destiny. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten messages on PSN from people trying to do that exact same thing. And honestly, that's just the start of what I want to see in social spaces. We need more things to do in them. A location to buy things, access our vault, and get quests are necessities, sure, but we need activities to do while we're there as well. Maybe introducing some sort of special board game or card game would be a huge addition. Other RPGs out there regularly do this. It doesn't even have to be a board game or a card game either. Maybe some sort of arcade machine to access a minigame to pass the time. I'm essentially saying add minigames. Social spaces would be the ideal spots for them. They don't need to reward us, they don't need to offer anything extravagant, just something to do if we get bored. Out of all the things I've mentioned so far, space combat probably has the highest chance of getting added to Destiny 2. Everyone wants it, it seems like a giant no-brainer. We all got spaceships in Destiny, but they didn't do anything. They even gave us a vendor who specializes in them, but they are nothing more than giant floating trophies. And now that it seems like we're being ousted from Earth in the new game, we're going to be going to new planets, so we're gonna run into opposing enemies. So space combat kinda seems like a given. All I ask for Bungie is to make this space combat fun. I don't expect them to get it perfect at first, but at the very least, it can be fun. Separate PvP and PvE. One of the key things that Bungie has done for Destiny is to keep everything inclusive, so whatever gear you had in PvE would be used in PvP. It fit with their grander themes, but I personally believe it hurt the game more than help. I can't count the many times a weapon I've loved using in PvE becomes suddenly weak because it was being abused in PvP. When I go into PvP, I expect to use different loadouts anyway, so I feel like that should be the definitive way of looking at the two different playstyles. Certain weapons are just more functional in PvP than they are in PvE, and vice versa. It's been like that since the beginning, and it's still that way now. So Bungie shouldn't hurt guns in PvE just to satisfy some sort of balance issue in PvP. This goes for character classes as well. They should just have an option to select loadouts if you are in a PvP activity versus a PvE activity. And I think that would solve a lot of the stress of trying to keep the game balanced. While Bungie may not necessarily agree with my stance on this, I personally believe it would make the game a million times better. Raids have always been the highlight of Destiny's PvE activities, and they have done a great job with making them very interesting, but I think they are flawed. They put so much emphasis on teamwork that it becomes very hard to really enjoy the raid itself. Let me explain. It's hard enough to find 5 other people to play with you on what is considered an endgame level activity. But if you don't have a clan or a group of friends you can easily turn to for raiding, you're going to have a bad time. Destiny's raids put a high level of stress on each player to make sure they are doing their jobs correctly, because just one mistake can lead to an entire team wiping, wasting a lot of time. This is infuriatingly frustrating. I've had more fights with people and friends over Destiny raids than anything else in my entire gaming life. This isn't healthy for many reasons. It has actually gotten to a point where I don't want to do raids because I don't want to fight with people. I want to enjoy the game, not lose my patience with my friends. Not everyone has these experiences, I understand, but not everyone also has the best schedules to just hop in and play for so long without much required team coordination. Bungie needs to find a solution to these problems so they can satisfy their community. They've done an excellent job with keeping the raids entertaining from a mechanic perspective, but need to dial down the difficulty of the teamwork aspects. I understand how difficult a job that would be, but I think there are ways to go about it. I believe one way is to look at raids differently. Raids are usually the only way to get the best gear in Destiny, but if that is no longer the case, then maybe the difficulty of those raids can be less intense, allowing for more leeway amongst a team. I'm also for the idea of introducing more than one raid in a single expansion, with the idea being one raid is meant to be more of an easier activity, with the other one being more intense. I was never a fan of the idea of hard mode raids. All they ever did was change up a few mechanics and make enemies stronger, and that was it. I would rather just have an entirely different raid and go back to the same one over and over just for a chance of better equipment. This idea plays into my next item on the list. Less repetition and grind. Vanilla Destiny was the biggest culprit of grinding. Nearly everything was controlled by RNG. It was incredibly frustrating. It took many players many months to get their desired loot due to the RNG system. Now Bungie has done a great job in reducing the RNG factors in their updates to Destiny, but there was still a fundamental problem with their system. You had to do the same activities over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Some of the reasons may be to doing daily bounties or getting their weekly activities done that usually require teammates. Everything in this game is built around the idea of you doing the same exact activity over and over. They might disguise it as doing a different gun multi-kill or using a different class, but you are inherently doing the same exact thing, all for a chance to grind experience on your weapons or factions, which is then tied to you potentially getting some good gear as a reward. So it gets ridiculous how much time you spend doing the same thing just for a chance to get good loot. What Bungie needs to do in the sequel is to eliminate all the repetition, or at the very least reduce it to such a minimum that it is no longer a slog to get through. If they implement a lot of things I have mentioned in this list already, they could make great strides to accomplishing this. A lot of what they do for weeklies and dailies can be modified so they can truly feel different and exciting. A lot of the stigma of the grind can be eliminated by just getting rid of the RNG based loot system completely. Whenever RNG is involved, it just becomes incredibly frustrating when you don't get the desired reward after 15 or more tries. Now I'm not suggesting that you should get everything easily, but instead I'm suggesting that after we complete an arduous task, it shouldn't be a low chance of getting something amazing. I could go into more detail about how they could go about this, but there are really many ways to do it, and Bungie has been showing signs of implementing some of those techniques. For example, the record books they have been giving out since Rise of Iron is a great strategy for this. It gives you a goal with a reward you'll know you'll get, and you know it won't be RNG based. Sure, there's still grind involved, but you don't feel like you might be wasting your time, because you know the reward is guaranteed. As I mentioned before, if some of my earlier ideas are implemented, that would give Bungie even more ways to give out loot, and even more ways to try to spice things up by adding some special events tied to those activities. While I feel like Bungie really wants to keep some RNG involved, I do think they are making great strides in this category, and I'm really hoping the sequel really makes things a lot less monotonous. Quit pretending you're not an MMORPG. Now, let me preface this item on the list by saying I don't actually have very much experience with MMORPGs. I played about a month's worth of Final Fantasy XI on the Xbox 360, and I have played literally about an hour of the beta of Final Fantasy XIV. So I don't really know how MMORPGs necessarily truly function on a larger scale, but I can tell Bungie doesn't want to admit to being one. I fear Destiny 2 is going to ditch any potential RPG elements it could have. We technically have a few stats, but they aren't affected in any way by leveling up. Everything is dictated by our gear or our class perks. I feel like this puts a major flaw in the game. Gear shouldn't really be affecting our stats that much, because it limits what we can potentially wear if we want to be able to do well in the game. While I do agree that some gear should be better than others, I feel like it shouldn't completely dictate our power. We need actual stats like an RPG. While we had some basic stats for armor, recovery, and speed, I believe we need a whole slew of stats so we can really build our characters differently from one another without needing the same exact setup as another player to do well in activity. Basically, I wish Destiny would embrace the idea of being more of an RPG like other games like Borderlands. I do also believe that guns themselves should have their own stats. While this is already present in the game, I want them to be more adjustable and have a larger potential for growth. How it is currently in the game is that guns largely have the same exact stats across the board. You're only allowed to change some of its stats if you happen to have the correct perks on the weapon. Otherwise, it is useless to you. This goes back to the RNG problem I mentioned before. Each gun should have the same perks, and then the customization should come from either leveling it up or adding potential extra gun parts. There are many ways to go about solving this issue, but what I'm concerned about is making the game much more organic versus being random. And this is just the RPG half of the MMORPG. Bungie doesn't want to admit it, but Destiny is pretty much an MMORPG. While everything might be sectioned off so we can't see a whole lot of the other players around, it is very obvious that they are around. So they should really embrace the idea of an MMO. I talked with other players who do play MMORPGs, and they agree Destiny already has a lot of MMO elements in place, so they have no reason to really deny it. By adding a lot of my earlier social activity suggestions would be a huge part to owning up to the idea of being an MMORPG. Maybe they could even add places for clans to get together, or even an auction house of sorts. They could do so much with this game if they really just open it up more and just embrace the idea of being an MMORPG. Don't tell us how to play the game. This one is a big one for me. Part of the 3 years of playing Destiny was getting told how to play the game by Bungie. They wouldn't tell us directly, but by actively making it impossible to do certain things in the game, they were pretty much telling us how to play the game. Let me explain. I understand if you need to change something because every player was abusing an exploit, but if everyone is doing that exploit due to an inherent problem with the game design, then maybe they need to tackle the game design choice over just saying, no, you can't do that. It's a tricky subject to handle because as a developer, you don't want players to circumvent the game design to get things done. But at the same time, you can't just take away ways to play the game. There are many occasions where I have agreed with certain changes, but many times to implement some updates to make sure you don't have a reason to do the thing you were doing. The biggest one for me is when they decided to make elemental primaries a thing of the past. All because of one man decided it isn't something we should have. That becomes infuriating because now I am being forced to play differently. I don't like that. A game should be allowed to be played in many different ways because not every gamer is the same. And a lot of what Bungie has done with the game causes a lot of players to make the same decisions because that is pretty much what Bungie said is the acceptable way to play. What I suggest Bungie to do in the future with Destiny 2 is to just allow players to play how they want and only step in when something is truly being abused. It's a difficult process, but if they just listen to the community more, then maybe these problems won't happen in the future. I would like everyone's opinion on this matter because I feel like this is a very polarizing subject. Do you feel cheated by the way Bungie constantly changes things, forcing to adopt different ways of play? Or do you feel like Bungie is doing exactly what they need to do to keep the community healthy? That wraps up my list of what I want to see in Destiny 2. I didn't forget about trading or adding new classes or enemies. There's just so much I wish Destiny originally had, but didn't. I wanted to keep my list as small as possible, so I limited it to only 10 items. There are clearly more things they should add to the sequel, but this list represents what I want to see in Destiny 2 more than anything else. Let me know what you guys want to see in Destiny 2 in the comments below. This is Firemac saying bye bye, see you next time, thanks for watching. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button.